So let's start on page 150. If you look at page 150, there's a section that starts there, section 25, an approach to the existential question of the who of Dasein. Okay, so we want to know, this is a sort of a weird question. We want to know the who of Dasein. I think it'll become clear what that amounts to. So he writes, the answer to the question of who Dasein is one that was seemingly given in section 9, where we indicated formally that the basic characteristic of Dasein is an entity which is in each case I myself, right? So what's the who of Dasein? I thought we answered it. It was like, I myself am the who of Dasein. He goes on later in that paragraph. The question of the who answers itself in terms of the I itself, the subject, the self. Okay, so when he starts using words like that, you know he's talking about something he doesn't agree with. The who is what maintains itself as something identical throughout changes. So this is the answer we're tempted to, right? We're tempted to say, well, the who of Dasein is me, is a self. That is a thing that exists as a kind of immaterial substance that persists through time. Plato called it a soul. Descartes called it a mind. And we know that's not going to be Heidegger's answer. He goes on, not quite halfway down the page, ontologically, right? By the way, the ontologically means to do with being or ways of being, as opposed to ontically, which he'll use ontic as well. And you could just think of ontic as having to do with beings. Ontologically, we understand it as something which is in each case already constantly present at hand. Okay, so it's tempting to think of the who of Dasein as a substance present at hand. And then the last part of that sentence, the Latin there, subjectum, as a subject. Tempting to think of ourselves as a immaterial substance present at hand. We're tempted to think of ourselves as a kind of like an ego, where you have, objects that we are related to, that we're like a self or an ego, and we're related to these objects, that sort of subject-object thing. We're tempted by all of that, but of course, we know enough about Heidegger to know he's going to tell us that is leading us ontologically astray, right? Misunderstanding the kind of being that we have. So on the same page, just keep going down the page, we're about 2/3 of the way down. Dasein is tacitly conceived in advance as something present at hand. This meaning of being is always implicated in any case where the being of Dasein has been left indefinite. In other words, where people fail to talk about the way we exist, you can bet that they're kind of implicitly thinking of us as existing as a substance present at hand. But then he says this, yet, of course we knew this was coming, yet presence at hand is the kind of being which belongs to entities whose character is not that of Dasein. Right? That is to say, that's not our kind of being. Our kind of being, of course, is existence. That's the name he gives it, the German word existence with a Z. That's the name he gives it. And he's been talking about the structures of our being, including, Dasein is distinguished by the fact that in its very being, its being is an issue for it. For Dasein to be is to face the question of how to be, all that kind of stuff. So, in thinking about the being of Dasein again, we can recall that Dasein, for Dasein to be, for us to be, is to confront the question of how to understand ourselves. It's to always be understanding ourselves in certain ways. Right? And that's different from pencils and cups and desks and things like that. They don't understand themselves in certain ways. And of course, we always do. And We always have understood ourselves in certain ways, and we continue to understand ourselves, sometimes in new ways, different ways. Start to think of myself as a jazz fan. Started listening to enough jazz. So ways of understanding yourself, obviously student and teacher comes up in this context. With the hammer, Heidegger's hammer, we think about a carpenter. Someone can understand themselves as a carpenter, as a jazz fan, as a student, as a teacher. So that's how Dasein works. And of course, to understand yourself in a certain way is to project yourself into certain ways of being. 184, I thought, was an interesting place to look that maybe adds a little bit to what we've already talked about in this context. So the very bottom of 184, I'm thinking about this notion of self-understanding. Dasein understands itself and it understands the world. Why does the understanding always press forward into possibilities? And here I think we can see that connection to Kierkegaard as well. It's because the understanding has in itself the existential structure which we call projection. With equal primordiality, the understanding projects Dasein's being both upon its for the sake of which and upon significance as the worldhood of its current world. So, for the sake of which is just Heidegger's name for that thing I was talking about before, being a teacher, being a jazz fan, being a student, right? So you're doing things for the sake of a certain identity or for the sake of being something. You gotta, if you're a Dasein, you gotta be something. And the way the things you can be are for the sake of whiches, and you sort of carry out that identity or maintain that identity through your engagement in the world. Skip down a few lines. Dasein is thrown into the kind of being which we call projecting. Projecting has nothing to do with comporting oneself toward a plan that has been thought out and in accordance with which Dasein arranges its being. On the contrary, any Dasein has, as Dasein, already projected itself, and as long as it is projecting. As long as it is, Dasein always has understood itself and always will understand itself in terms of possibilities. Projecting into the future, of course, right? Into possible ways of being. The very last sentence of this paragraph, as projecting, understanding is the kind of being of Dasein in which it is its possibilities as possibilities. Because of the kind of being which is constituted by the existentialism projection, Dasein is constantly more than it factually is. I'm going to skip over a little bit and take you to the very bottom there of page 185. Dasein is never anything less, that is to say, it is existentially that which, in its potentiality for being, it is not yet. Let me pull out a few words of that sentence. Skip over some words and reread that. Dasein, okay, it is what it is not yet. So this is that future part of the care structure. Okay. So Dasein makes itself be what it is by pressing into possibilities in terms of what it is not yet. I mentioned this, a while ago about, for a college student, being a college graduate is an interesting case, right? Because for a lot of college students, the possibility of being a college graduate structures a lot of their life. And it's something in the future, and it's something which you're not yet, right? So a possibility is a kind of, Kierkegaard maybe would say a kind of a nothingness, a kind of a non-thing, something that is not yet, but we often define ourselves in terms of being ahead of ourselves, in terms of this future component. I guess even going to the store to buy some milk, right? If you want cereal and you don't have any milk, you go to the store to buy milk. But notice that none of that really can work or make any sense unless you are somehow defining yourself in terms of that which you are not, projecting yourself into the future, into the possibility of being a person who's at the store buying milk. I mean, so even trivial stuff like that has this structure. So we know that Dasein is being in the world as care. Sorge, S-O-R-G-E, Sorge, care. Now, care is the translation. I don't have a better translation, but as is often the case, and as we've talked about, it somewhat gives the wrong impression, right? Because what it means, the beginnings of what it means is having some kind of meaningful relation to. So the pencil does not relate to the tablet with care. It doesn't have any kind of meaningful relationship to the tablet. It doesn't relate to the tablet at all, whereas we relate both to the pencil and to the tablet in what he calls Sorge, or care. Now, let's suppose that you don't care at all about pencils or tablets because you always type. Well, one way of having the Sorge relationship to pencils and tablets is not caring about them at all, right? So that's why it's a little misleading, because it's like, not giving a damn is another version of care. Both giving a damn and not giving a damn are versions of care. Whereas things that are not Dasein, you say, well, the desk doesn't give a damn about the other desk. And that's true, except that it's also true that it's not like it doesn't positively give a damn, but it's not like it doesn't not give a damn. It's just more maybe like a category mistake. It's not the kind of thing that can either give a damn or not give a damn, is what I'm trying to say there. So back to care. So part of what that care thing holds in it is this trifold of we relate to stuff in the present. Sein bei gets translated as alongside. That's the present. Alongside is the wrong word because there's never such a thing as a Dasein and a thing that are side by side. Rather, we are sein bei the present. That is to say, we're meaningfully related to it. We're amidst objects, equipment, meaningfully related to objects, equipment. That's the sein bei, that's the present element of care. And things show up to us in the present in part as a function of how we're projecting into the future. So that if I see my friend Ralph, and one way I'm being Dasein is I'm trying to be his friend, I'm trying to stay friends, then he'll show up in a different way than if I'm trying to avoid him because I've decided he's a crappy person and I don't want to be his friend anymore, right? So the present shows up meaningfully in a different way depending on how I'm projecting into the future. And all of that happens also on the basis of how I've been in the world in the past. And so the care structure has this ahead of itself, that's the future element, meaningfully related to, that's the present element, already in, bound up with definite ways of being, that's the past element.